the tranquil suburbs of Charleston, South Carolina, Margaret lived a simple, peaceful life. Her silver hair framed a face etched with kindness and wisdom, and her constant companion, Duke, a regal German shepherd, was her steadfast protector. Duke had entered her life as a frightened, malnourished pup at a shelter. Margaret's heart had instantly chosen him, and from that day on, he had become her unwavering guardian. Each morning, Margaret and Duke followed the same routine. They walked through the narrow streets, stopping by the bakery for fresh bread and exchanging warm greetings with neighbors. Duke was always alert, his intelligent eyes scanning their surroundings. "We're a team, aren't we, Duke?" Margaret often said, stroking his glossy black fur. He responded with a loyal gaze, silently promising to protect her. One morning, however, Duke's behavior changed. He stopped frequently during their walk, his ears perked, sniffing the air with unease. Margaret chuckled softly. "What's the matter, boy? Smelling a storm?" But his tension didn't ease. He nudged her gently but firmly toward home, a sense of urgency in his actions. Outside the bakery, Margaret noticed two men across the street. Their sharp stares sent a shiver down her spine. She tried to dismiss the feeling as paranoia, but Duke's low growl made her pause. Unbeknownst to her, the men, Ethan and Leo, were observing intently. "She's alone," Ethan murmured. "Just her and the dog. Easy target." Leo nodded, his eyes narrowing. Margaret hurried home, her pulse quickening. As she locked the door, Duke stood guard, his body taut with tension. That night, under the Charleston moonlight, Margaret tried to convince herself it was nothing. But Duke's unyielding stance by the door told her otherwise. Her loyal friend sensed danger lurking just beyond the threshold. Margaret struggled to shake the unease that shadowed her thoughts. Duke, ever vigilant, patrolled the house, his growls low and threatening at every faint sound. "What's gotten into you, boy?" she murmured, her voice laced with worry. But deep down, she trusted Duke's instincts. If he felt something was wrong, she couldn't ignore it. In the quiet of the night, Ethan and Leo lurked in a dark alley, their hushed voices plotting. Ethan smirked, adjusting the bandage on his arm from a previous altercation. "We take out the dog first," he said coldly. "Then the rest is easy." Leo, though wary of Duke's fierce demeanor, nodded. They would return when the time was right. As the clock ticked past midnight, Margaret finally drifted into a restless sleep, but Duke stayed awake. His ears twitched at every creak of the house, his eyes locked on the door. Suddenly, a faint sound outside made him growl, low and menacing. Margaret stirred, half asleep. "It's nothing, Duke," she mumbled, but her words faltered when she heard the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against the lock. The door burst open, and Margaret's scream pierced the silence. Ethan and Leo stormed in, their faces masked, their intentions clear. "Stay quiet, lady," Ethan barked, advancing toward her. Duke, however, launched himself at Ethan with a ferocious growl, his teeth sinking into the man's arm. Ethan yelled, struggling to free himself. "Get this dog off me," he shouted. Margaret, frozen in fear, watched as Duke fought fiercely. Leo lunged at the dog, but Duke turned on him with equal fury, forcing him to retreat. Margaret's terror transformed into determination. Grabbing a heavy vase, she struck Ethan, who stumbled back. Realizing they were no match for the dog's relentless attack, the intruders fled into the night. The first rays of dawn filtered through the broken door, casting light on the aftermath of the night's terror. Margaret sat in her kitchen, her trembling hands clutching a steaming cup of tea, trying to steady her nerves. Duke lay at her feet, his ears twitching at every sound, his eyes never straying far from the door. Despite his exhaustion, he remained vigilant, ready to defend her again if necessary. After a moment of hesitation, Margaret picked up the phone and called the police. Her voice wavered as she recounted the events of the night, the terrifying break-in, Duke's relentless bravery, and the intruder's ultimate retreat. Within the hour, Officers Bailey and Carter arrived, their professional demeanor softened by concern as they examined the damaged door and took Margaret's statement. Officer Bailey, a younger man with kind eyes, knelt beside Duke and ran a hand gently along his back. "You've got a real hero here, man," he said with admiration. "Not every dog would have the courage to face down two armed men like that." Duke responded with a soft growl, his gaze still fixed on the officers as though assessing whether they posed any threat. Margaret, still shaken but filled with pride, knelt to stroke Duke's fur. "He's more than just a dog," she murmured. "He's my protector, my family." However, Officer Carter's expression was more serious. "Miss Margaret, I won't sugarcoat it. Those men may come back. They know you live alone, and they'll be desperate now. I strongly recommend installing more locks and a security system." Margaret nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect my home." That evening, as the house grew quiet, Margaret watched Duke patrol each room. His steadfast presence reassured her, but the lingering fear reminded her that the danger was far from over. Duke, ever loyal, stayed close, his sharp instincts promising he'd be ready for whatever came next. The clock struck midnight, and an uneasy stillness settled over the house. Margaret lay in bed, her body exhausted but her mind restless. Duke, ever watchful, paced the hallway, his sharp ears picking up the faintest of sounds. His growls came low and steady, a warning Margaret could no longer ignore. She sat up, her heart pounding. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Suddenly, a soft metallic click broke the silence. Margaret froze as the sound of scraping against the lock reached her ears. Her pulse quickened as she grabbed her phone, dialing the police with shaky fingers. Before she could speak, a loud crash shattered the quiet. Her front door was forced open. Two shadowy figures stormed in, their faces masked, their movements calculated. It was Ethan and Leo. "Playtime's over, old lady," Ethan snarled, gripping a metal rod. His partner, Leo, held a knife, his gaze cold and menacing. Margaret backed away, fear gripping her. "Please, leave me alone," she cried. But before Ethan could advance, Duke sprang into action. With a ferocious growl, he lunged at Ethan, his powerful jaws clamping down on the man's arm. Ethan screamed, stumbling backward as Duke dragged him to the ground. "Get this dog off me," he yelled in panic. Leo moved to strike Duke, but the dog, swift and determined, dodged the knife and turned his focus on the second intruder. He leapt at Leo, knocking the man into the wall. Margaret, overcome with adrenaline, grabbed a nearby chair and swung it at Ethan, who was trying to stand. The blow sent him sprawling. In the chaos, the wail of sirens grew louder, and flashing red and blue lights lit up the room. The police stormed in, shouting commands. Ethan and Leo, realizing they were outmatched, dropped their weapons and surrendered. Margaret collapsed onto the floor beside Duke, who stood protectively by her side. His body still tense. She wrapped her arms around him, tears streaming down her face. "You saved me again, my brave boy," she whispered. As the officers cuffed the intruders, one turned to Margaret. "Thanks to your dog, ma'am. We caught them red-handed. He's a hero." Margaret nodded, her voice breaking with emotion. "He's my guardian angel." By the time the sun rose, the chaos of the night had subsided, leaving Margaret's home in a fragile peace. She stood in the living room, surveying the broken door and scattered debris. The sight brought a fresh wave of emotion, but her heart swelled with gratitude as she looked at Duke, resting nearby. Though he was tired and bruised, his sharp eyes stayed watchful, ready to protect her again if needed. Later that morning, Officers Bailey and Carter returned to check on Margaret. They brought good news. Ethan and Leo were in custody, and evidence found on them tied them to other crimes in the area. "You're safe now," Officer Bailey assured her, "but we're here to help if you ever need anything." Bailey's expression softened as he crouched beside Duke, stroking his glossy fur. "He's more than just a hero," he said with a smile. "He's remarkable." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she nodded, "He's my everything," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. That afternoon, Margaret received a call from the police station. The chief had heard about Duke's bravery and wanted to recognize him in a special ceremony. Hesitant but proud, Margaret agreed, knowing Duke deserved every bit of the honor. At the small but heartfelt event, Margaret stood beside Duke as the police chief spoke. "Today we honor a true hero. Duke is not just a dog, he's a symbol of courage, loyalty, and love." The chief bent down, placing a gleaming medal around Duke's neck, and applause filled the room. Margaret, holding back tears, stroked Duke's fur as he sat proudly, his calm demeanor unchanged despite the attention. That evening, back home, Margaret prepared a special dinner for Duke. She watched him eat, her heart full of gratitude and love. Once he finished, the two of them sat on the porch, the stars twinkling above. Duke rested his head on her lap, the medal still glinting around his neck. "You're more than a hero, Duke," Margaret whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "You're my protector, my family, my everything." Duke's tail thumped gently against the porch, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond they shared. Under the vast, peaceful sky, Margaret and Duke sat together, no longer afraid of what the future might bring. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, their unbreakable bond shining brighter than ever. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our latest videos. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Thank you all for taking the time to watch, and see you in the next video.